The Democracy Forum brings you another not-to-be-missed webinar, Vacuum of Power, Gaza's Next Chapter. In the wake of reduced hostilities between Israel and Hamas, Gaza's future hangs in the balance. What will the next chapter look like for Gaza and its people? What are the key legal and political challenges for Trump's 20-point plan? How might the future of Gaza interact with Israeli decision-making and domestic politics? And, amid competing claims to legitimacy, is a unified vision for governance possible, with the people of Gaza included in decision-making? To learn more about these and related issues, tune into our live debate, bringing your comments and questions for our expert panel.
Hello and welcome. I am Humphrey Hawksley, and this is a Democracy Forum debate where we discuss and analyze issues, many of which are overlooked by the mainstream media, but not this one. Vacuum of Power, Gaza's Next Chapter. It's all over the news. It's one of those polarizing issues, the most of our times, when so many other wars and tensions on territory, religion and bad history do manage to get solved. Israel and Palestine never seem to get there. But we're not doing history today. We're looking forward to the next chapter. Can there be peace? If so, how? To debate and test ideas, we have a superb panel. Julie Norman, Dalal Iriqat, Toby Green, and the Democracy Forum Chair, Barry Gardiner MP, will sum up at the end and tell us if we've broken any new ground. But to start, I have the privilege of asking Democracy Forum President, Lord Charles Bruce, to give us the background and canvas of our debate.
Good afternoon and welcome to the webinar, which seeks clarity on the ceasefire agreement and 20-point plan, which President Trump has unveiled with the intention of bringing the Gaza conflict to an end. I thank the Forum for arranging the discussion of this important topic at such a critical time, and I extend my gratitude to the panellists for agreeing to participate in the webinar. As ever, we're very grateful to Humphrey Hawksley for taking the role of moderator. A month has now lapsed since the signing at Sharm el-Sheikh of the Trump Declaration for Enduring Peace and Prosperity, the final part of the Trump administration's peace overture for Gaza, which followed publication of the 20-point plan on the 29th of September and the release of a document entitled Implementation Steps on the 9th of October. In the wake of the Egypt conference, however, no timeline has been announced to negotiate the next phases of the peace plan, concludes the Council of Foreign Affairs. I quote, "The first stage of this peace plan is the easy part," warns Senior Fellow for Middle Eastern Studies, Elliot Abrams. There is no doubt that the Trump plan is deficient in several important respects, as the Harvard Political Review observes. Among the more obvious shortcomings, the plan doesn't address Israel's continued occupation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. There is little attention paid to reconciliation. It is ambiguous about the intractable problem of Palestinian unity. It is vague about the proposals for achieving lasting peace and statehood, and it glosses over the difficulties likely to be encountered in determining the role of an international peacekeeping force. Indeed, the whole basis of the plan appears to be predicated on achieving peace through economic growth, where development will be overseen by a board of technocrats with minimal local participation, thus representing, I quote, "a return of intellectual, apolitical administration, imposing best practice with little regard for local conditions." Writing for the European Journal of International Law, Leon Seidel suggests that the shortcomings will make it, I quote, "highly unlikely that the 20-point plan will succeed in the long term, and neither Hamas's reticence nor Israel's behavior is raising high hopes for the short term." Well, thank you very much for deciding to watch the webinar today. And if you have any questions or comments, please pass them to the panel through the chair.
Thank you, Lord Charles Bruce. No timeline, vague glossing over shortcomings, and the whole basis of it predicated on achieving peace through economic growth. Well, let's see what happens. Let's see what our panelists have to say about that. Our first speaker is Dr. Julie Norman, an associate professor of politics and international relations at University College London, with a speciality in conflict, peace building, and political violence. Her latest co-authored book out a few weeks ago is Gaza, The Dream and the Nightmare. And in her many articles, she's written why it matters to recognize Palestine, and on this current ceasefire one entitled, Will This Time Be Different? Will it, Julie Norman? Tell us the next chapter.
Well, thank you, Humphrey and Lord Bruce, for the introductions, and to the forum for hosting this very important discussion. I look forward to hearing from my esteemed co-panelists also. To really start, obviously this ceasefire is different. It already is different. We've seen the absolutely incredible, important release of the living hostages from Israel, and also the release of about 2,000 Palestinian prisoners. But I think where the worry is right now is that the ceasefire will stall or freeze, if you will, at this phase one, really because of the same issues that have prevented previous ceasefires from going into effect over these last 2 years. As Lord Bruce indicated, even this first part, this part that's supposed to be the easy part, has been very fraught and very difficult. While there was the release of the living Israeli hostages, there was a long delay in the release of all the deceased hostages, with 4 of those deceased hostages' bodies still not yet returned. Israel sees this as a violation of the ceasefire. At the same time, over 240 Gazans have been reported killed, and over 1,500 structures have been destroyed, which Hamas and many international observers see as a violation of the ceasefire. And I would add that aid, humanitarian aid, while increasing in flow, is still much less than what's needed, with about a quarter of the number of trucks entering the strip that are needed to address the very dire needs in Gaza. So the fragility is on full display, even with this first phase. And as always, getting to the second phase issues has always been the biggest obstacle. And most of those challenges still are either unresolved or unaddressed. So I'll just walk through what a few of those are, where things stand now, and touch on a bit of the UK's approach or role in that. The first element to focus on, I think, is security. And, our topic today is focused on this the vacuum of power. And the longer you have this security vacuum, the harder it will be to have governance, reconstruction, or any of the other elements we talk about. In Trump's plan, he identified the deployment of an international stabilization force, the ISF. But it's been very unclear up till now of who will serve in this force, and specifically what their mandate will be. The US has set up a civil military coordination center in Israel. There are some UK officials advising there, but again, who will actually be on the ground is yet to be seen, and that's largely because the mandate has not been really agreed upon. If this force will have a more monitoring role, so more like peace monitors, or an enforcement role in which they will be actually tasked to perhaps, engage in armed operations with Hamas or with other actors. So there is a UN Security Council draft resolution circulating around this. The US issued this about a week ago, and the UK and other actors are feeding into this and pushing back a little bit at the vagueness of the US's draft, and also the suggestion that the force would be involved in disarmament. So that security piece is number one. Very closely related to that is what I just mentioned, is this question of Hamas disarmament. Again, this was listed as a bullet point in the Trump plan, but there was no real indication of who would lead on this, how it would happen, and really how to get Hamas to agree with it. The UK has been, I would say, pretty directly involved in some of the advising on this, really based off lessons learned from the Northern Ireland decommissioning. They've been suggesting elements from that were seen as kind of positive incentives, third-party verification, phase disposal over time, and other elements. But I would say one of the key differences is that there was a political vision in the Northern Ireland case that is simply not there now with Palestine and with Hamas. So right now, there is very little incentive, many would see, for Hamas to disarm without some kind of political pathway or vision, especially when Israel is still controlling over half of Gaza. That leads me then to the third point of Israeli withdrawal. Israel does control about 53% of the Gaza Strip right now, and that area is pretty much a no-go zone for most Gazans. The timeline for withdrawal is very unclear, unknown, would likely be pegged to disarmament if or when it happens. But we can see that on the ground, Israel seems to be preparing for a long-term defensive posture along what is now being called the yellow line and starting to develop infrastructure there and whatnot. So it's, my analysis and others that I think if we're being realistic, this yellow line will probably be in place for some time, especially if there is no disarmament, in which case we will de facto almost see a bifurcation of the Gaza Strip into an east and west side with Israel in control of the eastern side, and either Hamas or any other kind of whoever will fill that void in the West. And there's a lot of concerns about this model, if it would essentially like reinforce an occupation type of model like the West Bank or something different. If there is disarmament from Hamas, I think there will be more of a withdrawal, but Israel does want to maintain some kind of security perimeter in the Strip and wants to have some sort of strike force capabilities kind of with whatever happens. But I think that is far down the line. The last outstanding piece I would just mention is governance, but I think others on the panel are going to get into that, so I won't say too much on that. But just to say that this technocratic committee has been loosely identified, but there's still no clear role on what happens after that. So just to summarize, I would say the stumbling blocks that prevented a long-lasting ceasefire in previous rounds of this conflict of the last 2 years are still there. Hamas wants a full Israeli withdrawal. They want some future role or relevance, and they want some sort of self-determination for Palestine. Israel, on the other hand, wants to maintain security control. They want no role for Hamas whatsoever, or the PA for that matter, and no pathway to a Palestinian state. I'll add that a big wild card here is, of course, Trump and US pressure on Israel. Trump has shown that he's willing to use leverage. He has a different type of relationship with Arab leaders and regional leaders than previous US presidents. And he does, I think, want some kind of regional stability. But Trump is just a very different type of leader than we've seen in the past. Obviously, his decisions and intentions don't always have staying power, and he's often easily distracted and easily swayed. So I would say, given that it's a moment, I would say it's a moment of need, urgency, and opportunity for the UK, along with Europe and regional actors, to stay united in this push for keeping some kind of ceasefire on track, pushing for Hamas decommissioning, and also pushing alongside that for Palestinian self-determination. Thank you.
From what you say, are we actually in a vacuum at the moment, or is it that the two forces are just facing each other down across the yellow line, or whatever you want to call it? So there is no vacuum. Israel is still the power and Hamas is still the power.
Yes, so I would say right now, things are very much in flux. I think that Hamas emerged with still more of an organizational capacity than many thought that they would. They also, engaged in a lot of intra-Palestinian fighting in the early days and weeks right after the ceasefire to try and dissipate some of the groups that would pose challenges to them. So I would just say this is not the type of government that many Palestinians want or want to live under. And I think there is still a vacuum in terms of actually representative government in Palestine, and Palestinians have not really been consulted on that at all in either part of the Strip. On the Israeli,
Yeah, I'm just going to, it leads into a question from Peter Cornish in the audience here. What are likely to be the main resistance to a return of the Palestinian Authority in Gaza? You've answered that, haven't you? Or answer it again.
Yeah, so I would say this is a big sticking point, because many regional actors who have been pushing for the ceasefire, and who also, I would say, want Hamas to disarm and to kind of vacate, as well as the US, very importantly, does want to see a role for the Palestinian Authority in Gaza in the long term. This is usually referred to as a kind of a reformed, a PA 2.0, if you will. And the UK supports that model as well. Right now, though, Israel under the current government has been rejecting that approach, that model. In addition to obviously rejecting Hamas role, they have been rejecting a PA role up to this point as well. And that's something that is part of these negotiations.
Okay. So we have getting back to the power. The powers are still there. The vacuums or the lack of a disarmament, the lack of a political vision, the lack of the technocratic committee or the international stabilization force. That's not so much a vacuum. That's just they're not there at the moment. I want to put a final question that comes from what Lord Bruce said, quoting somebody: the whole basis of the plan appears to be predicated on achieving peace through economic growth. That is how many chapters down the road?
I would say it's pretty far down the road. But as I mentioned, this idea of a divided Gaza is one thing that could bring that forward in the part of the Strip that is currently controlled by Israel. If Israel and the US decide this is a long-term situation, there are some proposals on the table that the U.S. alongside Israel would try and develop that part of the Strip. And this is a lot of where I think Trump's personal interests are in with this deal. But again, we are still far from that. And I think many actors, regional, European, British, are very firm on the fact that what happens in Gaza needs to stay united. Palestine needs to stay united, and we need to be very careful about bifurcating it even further with either economic or political trajectories.
Thank you very much for that. We now go on to Dalal Iriqat, who's Associate Professor at the Arab American University of Palestine and a weekly columnist at AlQuds newspaper. She is the founding president of Business Women Network in Palestine, as well as being a key player in many other organizations, along with much of her focus about bringing change to the Palestinian society through education and improving Palestinian diplomacy. One of her latest pieces is the need for Palestinian women's leadership in recovery and peace building. How would that work? Dalal Iriqat, give us your picture of the next chapter.
Well, thank you very much, Humphrey, and thanks to the Democracy Forum as well. Well, talking about Gaza, it's very important to start with the fact that there are so many elephants in the room, except for an important fact, which is the Palestinians are not on board. There is no Palestinian agency, no matter what, on the design or the shapes or the thinking or the visioning of the day after in Gaza. That is a sad fact, yet it is a necessity for those who want to look at Gaza from a conflict resolution perspective. All experts and academics know very well that in conflict resolution, if we are serious about a sustained peace and stability and security, then the primary parties have to take their solid roles, not only on negotiations, but also in determination of what that solution should look like. And on determination, we look at the Trump's plan, which was very much welcomed, of course, by the Palestinians and by all the regional players and the international European players. Yet, the plan, as much as it is welcomed, lacks certain elements which we find essential. First of all, the plan is not anchored in international law. It lacks a legal dimension. It lacks in conflict resolution and in the field of negotiations. It lacks a very important element to any success for negotiations, which is basically legitimacy. There is no legitimacy behind this plan. And when I talk about legitimacy, I refer to UN resolutions, I refer to the Palestinian inalienable rights that are embedded in the UN system. The Palestinians have more than 1,000 UN General Assembly resolutions and 100 UN Security Council resolutions that safeguard the Palestinians' rights, not only in their right to self-determination, but also the right of, in East Jerusalem, the right to have Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem as a one territorial contiguity and one Palestinian entity in terms of administration, politics, economics, and security. The plan looks at Gaza from a totally isolated lens, and it actually looks at Gaza from a new liberal approach as well, where we see that the economic solutions are coming to replace the political rights of the Palestinian people. I'm not here to say that we as Palestinians or as scholars in conflict resolutions might oppose having, the Riviera in Gaza. Not at all. We want investments. We want good standards of living for every citizen, including the 2.2 million civilians in Gaza. Yet, those economic situation or solutions should not come to replace the political rights of the Palestinian people. Another point, which is, the plan looks at the Palestinian cause in general from a humanitarian lens. I'm not denying the fact that humanitarian needs are a priority for the 2.2 million civilians deprived of basic rights. Yes, they do need emergency aid in food, medicine, electricity, water, shelters, homes, medical services, education. That's not to be contested. Yet, the Palestinian cause is not about a humanitarian file. It's not about the Palestinians asking for charity. And in the late in November, on the 29th of November, we will commemorate the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. The Palestinian people message today: we don't want charity. We don't want anybody to look at Palestine and our rights from a charity perspective. No, solidarity means bringing back hope, and bringing back hope means going back and reassuring guarantees and respect and trust in the international law, in the international world order, in legitimacy, on what makes us a human, and the universal human rights, in the principles, rather than the interests and the wins and the profits. It's not a win-lose scenario of games. It should be a win-win in 2025. The fact that the world is tolerating the documented war crimes against the Palestinian people, all the international law mechanisms and the international world order is put at crisis. It's put at a lot of question marks. And this is not only for the sake of the Palestinian people. This is for the sake of humanity and for preserving the international world order. So no humanitarian lens, no economic lens should be replacing the political track and the political rights of the Palestinian people. Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem are still occupied by the Israeli military occupation. Again, as an expert in conflict resolution, I am obliged to remind the decision makers from the US, Europe, and all the international community, including the Palestinians as well, and the regional Arab mediators, that if we are serious about finding peace, stability, prosperity, and security in the Middle East, then we have to start by tackling the root cause of instability and violence in the region. And this root cause starts with the military occupation. The ICJ ruling of July 2024 stipulated very clearly that the occupation is illegal, unlawful, and it put a time frame of 12 months for the occupation to end. It actually also elaborated and talked about settlements and the settler colonial project. And it shed light on the fact that settlements are the obstacle and the main barrier towards peace and the two-state solution. And this takes me to the point that if we agree that we are talking about resolving this conflict, and not only managing this conflict, and not only containing this conflict, then we have to start by ending the Israeli military occupation. We also, it's important to also realize the need that the definition of the border of the State of Israel is also indispensable. Because as we saw lately, there had been a tsunami of recognitions for the Palestinian state. As much as the Palestinians are fond and are very much welcoming and grateful to the states that are recognizing the Palestinian state, yet in political theory, we're also reminded that at the end of the day, it is sovereignty that matters. And we're also reminded that the Palestinian political aspirations lie in their liberation, in their freedom, in their dignity, in their independence, in realizing their right to self-determination in a state, and not vice versa. So as long as the recognitions stay in their symbolic frameworks, I don't think we're talking about sustainable, serious peace, not for the Palestinians, not for the Israelis, and not for the region. For the plan as well, there was no time frame, there was no guarantees, and here I'm laying out the missing components, if I may say. So the fact that there was no time frame for the implementation or the transition into phases, there were no guarantees. The guarantees were totally verbal and totally unilateral. really specify any role or any obligation on the concerned parties, and it did not name out the occupation. It did not talk about the international law. There is no legal basis. So, and there was a straightforward deviation from the Global Alliance for the implementation of the two-state solution. And that's why we saw a lot of regional powers and Islamic powers trying to come on board the Trump's plan. I don't think because they think it's a better plan. I think because they realize that they need to bring back the Trump's plan into its legal base, into its legitimate base when we talk about the political rights and the UN system and the international law, the 4 Geneva Conventions. It also lacks the guarantees that would take us to a sustained, inclusive and strategic solution. It talks about transitional scenarios and transitional mechanisms with lessons learned, not only for the Palestinians, but also from different contexts of conflicts around the world, that transitional mechanisms, unfortunately, turned to be, sustain the status quo. And this is very, very dangerous when it comes to the Palestinian-Israeli question. In the Palestinian reality today, any day after for Gaza needs to have Palestinian agency. Any day after for Gaza needs to tackle the root causes of instability and insecurity and violence in the region, which is the military occupation that is prolonged, that is illegal. It needs to tackle also the settler colonial project that has demographically and geopolitically and from a realpolitik perspective hindered any possibility for the two-state solution that we are still advocating for in very civilized rhetoric coming from all member states. We need to talk about, given the Trump's plan and his neoliberal way of thinking, it's important to realize that the Palestinians want state institutions rather than real estate projects and investments. Stabilizing force, it's about time we realize that the Palestinian people need urgently a force of protection, a protective force. In Gaza, in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, the Palestinians are facing settler terrorism on daily basis, and settlers are also backed and protected by the Israeli soldiers. So Gaza, the West Bank and East Jerusalem need to be looked at as Palestine. It really aches my heart as a Palestinian that Gaza is being treated and looked at isolated, separate file, and that we're forgetting the fact that Gaza is part of the state of Palestine that the Palestinians are dreaming of in their right to self-determination. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Given that the military occupation and all these other things that you described there, they're not going to go overnight, and we're talking about the next chapter. Is there, as Julie Norman said, is there a political vision from the Palestinians as a whole to be followed? Because there's the Palestinian Authority, there's Hamas, there's all sorts of things there. Where do you start? I think that's my question. Where do you start on this for the next chapter?
Well, I think the Palestinians need agency. The PNA is ready to act as government, yet I also realize the setbacks internally. The Palestinian people deserve, according to the basic law, the constitution, to vote their leadership, to go to ballots and to elections.
And you also mentioned very interesting thing there, that economic solutions should not replace political ones. But given, would it not be better to start some sort of economic solution in a way? And then, because you need rule of law for an economy and all that sort of thing, the political things might fall into place?
Yeah, but our lessons learned, it has been a deja vu scenario where the transitional mechanisms become sustained realities and imposed facts on our grounds. And, for the past 35 years, the Palestinian people were promised sovereignty, statehood, independence. And look where we are today. We are at a more entrenched military occupation, more settler colonialism, more apartheid, more documented war crimes that had reached a genocidal war in 2025, extrajudicial killings on daily basis, administrative detentions.
Sorry.
What we need, I want to answer your question. What we need to go forward is to anchor back to respecting the application of international law equally on all the states. It is not okay that Israel continues to enjoy impunity.
Who is going to police that? because we now know all over the world that international law is being questioned. There's nobody to sort of step in like, say, they did in Bosnia to sort of oversee the peace. That doesn't exist. So what do you suggest for this next chapter, given that situation?
Well, I will continue to call for accountability and for holding the criminals accountable. Yet, from a Palestinian perspective, I came together with around 10 scholars from Palestine and the diaspora, and we laid out with the Cambridge Institute for Peace Settlement a full plan in writing, because the Palestinians are always blamed for the past decades for not proposing, but also for rejecting the peace plans. We proposed a decent plan anchored in international law of the responsibilities, to start with the Palestinian leadership. Here we have to realize that the Palestinians have the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which should stand and which should be accepted and should be brought to the table as the representative of the Palestinian people. Hamas is a fig leaf. Hamas is a fig leaf and is a pretext for Israel. So Israel will continue to empower Hamas, talk about Hamas, because it is the excuse that they are using to justify their war crimes against the Palestinian people.
Can I then put in a question from one of our audience, Rashid Ali, that goes into that? What reforms may be needed to ensure the legitimacy and effectiveness of the Palestinian Authority in Gaza?
It's a very important question. We want reforms for the Palestinian people all over, not only in Gaza. We want everybody to look at Gaza as part of Palestine. We want one government for Palestine, one gun, one state, one president. However, the reforms that the international community is talking about are not the reforms which the Palestinian people are asking for. The Palestinian people want serious reforms, political reforms, elections, democracy cycle, where we go to the ballots to choose our leadership. We don't accept the imposed realities of personalities and of facts on our grounds. So the reform requires that those, even if we go or tend to go to traditional mechanisms right now because of the complexity of holding elections in the coming year, yet this should not neglect the fact or deprive the Palestinian people the fact that they need, and the right that they need to choose the leadership. For Gaza also, the people of Gaza need to take agency. The people of Gaza need to take the lead in envisioning and governing Gaza. Women in Gaza were targeted by 70% under the Israeli fire. Women in Gaza are those entrepreneurs, architects, and academics, and they come from all sorts of this world, and they deserve to have a seat at the negotiating table. To tolerate the fact that Palestinians are having people by proxy negotiating on behalf of them should not be acceptable if we are serious about a sustained peace.
Thank you very much for that. Stay with us because we will come back to you. I've got some cracking questions coming in from the audience here. But now we go to Toby Green, Associate of Hebrew and Jewish Studies Department at University College London and Director of Public Affairs for the Board of Deputies of British Jews. Among his many writings and broadcasts are his book, Blair, Labour and Palestine, which is quite apt given Britain's conundrum at the moment, and an opinion piece recently in Israeli Strategy for a post-Hamas Gaza. Tell us more, Toby Green. How does Israel see the next chapter?
Well, thank you very much, Humphrey, and thank you to the Democracy Forum for inviting me. I just will mention that I'm really only speaking in my own personal capacity as a researcher and an analyst, and I'm not representing any organization with my remarks here, just my own perspectives. And thank you for mentioning that paper that I published. In fact, it's not so recent. The remarkable thing is I published that paper on the need for an Israeli strategy for the Gaza Strip, a political strategy, barely 2 weeks after the outbreak of the war on the 7th of October. And the war broke out 7th of October 2023 with Hamas's murderous attack into Israel, which killed 1,200 people and involved the abduction and capture of 250 more taken into the Gaza Strip. It was just a couple of weeks after the outbreak of war that, together with my colleague at Bar-Ilan University in Israel, I published, Professor Jonathan Reinhold, we published that paper. And it was at a moment where most Israelis were completely incapable of focusing on the question that we're trying to address in this discussion here, which is what should be the political future of the Gaza Strip, and therefore what should be Israel's political strategy to accompany and lie behind its military strategy in the Gaza Strip. Israelis were incapable of focusing on that in that moment of shock and horror in the wake of the 7th of October. But perhaps because I happened to be in London at that time, I had a little more distance. And I, together with my colleague, Professor Reinhold, we were able to put on the table very clearly the options. And the options are not that many. It's either a return to the rule of Hamas, it's either Israeli rule and Israeli occupation, an international protectorate, the Palestinian Authority, or some kind of hybrid of the Palestinian Authority with international backing and support and framework. At that time, we advocated the last of those options as really being the only way to create a sustainable political order, which was ultimately in Israel's interests. And 2 years on, that closely reflects what has emerged as the international consensus with the framework of the Trump plan. And it's not that we were so brilliant or so prescient. It's just that when you look at the options, there aren't that many, and that seemed to be the only one that has any chance of sustaining a political order, which, as I say, we thought was in Israel's interest. We were certainly not the only ones saying similar things at that time. I think we were perhaps among the first to say something like that to an Israeli audience in Hebrew. But it took many months for the Israeli discourse to really engage with that question of what we call in Hebrew, Hayom She'acharei, the day after, what comes after the war. Eventually, it became a focal point for media discourse in Israel, and then a key source of political division within Israel's governing coalition, and actually a division between Israel's political leadership and its military leadership. The inability of the Netanyahu coalition to define a coherent political endgame, and therefore I would argue also to define a very clear military strategy for the Gaza Strip, has a lot to do with its internal politics. Netanyahu, as some of you may know, is still amazingly on trial on 3 counts of corruption. He gives evidence very regularly each week in his own defense. But that has made him dependent on far-right political parties to stay in power in Israel. And to keep them in his coalition, he has avoided very consistently really articulating or buying into any kind of plan for the end state after the war, certainly one that would have international buy-in and consensus. That dynamic is now changing. The coalition in Israel is of diminishing relevance. Interestingly, the far-right parts of the coalition did not carry out their threat to quit Netanyahu's government as a result of the ceasefire, but that really doesn't matter at this point. Israel is going to elections anyway. By law, there has to be an election in Israel no later than the 27th of October, 2026. In practice, it will almost certainly be sooner, probably by the early summer. That's because the government must pass a budget by the end of the year. If it doesn't, then it falls after 3 months by default, and that means it'll fall by the end of March. So elections in the early summer, it could come soon, and Netanyahu could preempt that by triggering an election in Israel at any time. Netanyahu's bloc, if you look at opinion polls, is polling in the low 50s, and the opposition to Netanyahu is polling in the high 50s, and the target to be able to form a government in Israel is 61. To stay in power, Netanyahu needs to stop anyone else being able to form a coalition, and he's unlikely to win back a lot of support from opposition parties, but he needs to dominate the right of the political map in Israel. So his political survival depends on navigating between his right-wing base and the pressures being placed on him internationally, and especially the pressures being placed on him by the Trump administration. In that context, actually, Netanyahu is, in some sense, served by a kind of limbo, the sort of stalling and slowing of the process. Keeps his options open, reduces pressure on him to have to make commitments that may harm him politically. Tragically, that kind of limbo situation that we found ourselves in over the last few weeks also serves the interests of Hamas. And that is why I think very deliberately they've dragged out the return of the bodies of hostages who were killed as long as they can, with all kinds of subterfuges that have now been exposed. Because by delaying and stalling the return of the bodies of the hostages, they can put off the question of the next stage, which includes disarmament. They've bought themselves time to settle scores on the streets in the most brutal way, to regroup and to prepare for the next stage, in which I think for Hamas, whoever in theory will end up running things above ground, their determination, I'm sure, is that they will run things below ground or in the background, figuratively and literally underground. What broke the tie and forced the ceasefire a few weeks ago was a combination of Arab and US pressure on both Israel and on Hamas. And that is the mechanism that can force both those parties, the Netanyahu coalition and Hamas, to do things that they would otherwise try to defer or to avoid. By contrast, for the Israeli, let's say, center or center-left or kind of mainstream strategic thinking that is not kind of shaped or politically dependent on the ideological positions of the far right, they perceive that we actually are in a moment of unprecedented opportunity to actually disarm Hamas. But the kind of center ground in Israel, center left, recognizes that that is dependent on creating momentum towards, or being at least open to, the restoration of the Palestinian Authority in the Gaza Strip, not least because that is a condition for getting the buy-in of moderate Arab states like the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. But there is also a very high risk of this opportunity, which is to disarm Hamas, to genuinely replace Hamas with a non-Hamas authority, which is a key condition for reaching a goal of a kind of reunified Palestinian Authority governing both Palestinian areas of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, which of course is a prerequisite for then the more long-term goal of 2 states. So getting Hamas out of the picture or disarming them is critical for all of that, but there's a very high risk that opportunity will be squandered, not only by Netanyahu and his political restrictions, but also by, of course, by the obstructionism of Hamas and their determination to hold on to their weapons and their power, but also by an attempt to kind of fudge that with some kind of non-serious international effort or mechanism to, in theory, disarm Hamas, which doesn't really do the job. And we have a kind of bad experience from an Israeli perspective in this. In the case of UNIFIL, the mechanism that's supposed to, or was supposed to, disarm Hezbollah or keep Hezbollah away from Israel's border in South Lebanon, which of course failed to function. So we want to avoid that experience, and we're going to need a UN resolution that gives real power to an international stabilization force. And just, I think in that context, I think it is important for me to kind of respond to one or two things that Dalal said. And I want to stress that there were many things that Dalal said that I actually really strongly agree with. In particular, the need for any future governance arrangement to have Palestinian agency and Palestinian legitimacy. To my mind, those things are critical for creating a sustainable political order. But there's another thing that Dalal said that I think I need to take issue with. And that is the notion that the root cause of this is Israeli occupation. Now, of course, Israeli occupation is part of the problem. But from an Israeli sort of experience or perspective, that notion is, as Dalal framed it, is a bit incomprehensible. And the reason is, in 2005, Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip, all of its settlements and all of its military forces. And the consequence was not peace, but rather that vacuum, and what was filled by radical Islamist force in the form of Hamas. So part of the root of the problem here and of the conflict here is that any weakly governed space in the Middle East is vulnerable to being filled up with radical Islamist extremist forces. And that's what we saw in the Gaza Strip when Israel withdrew. It's what we saw in southern Lebanon when Israel withdrew in 2000. It's what we've seen, of course, in many other parts of the region. So if we don't recognize that we need to address that problem, that tendency for weakly governed spaces in the region to be filled up with Islamist extremists who are then going to use them, backed by Iran in many cases, who are going to use them as basis to attack Israel as part of a long-term war of attrition to destroy the state of Israel, a war that's been a dimension of the war that's been played out over the last 2 years, where Israel has been fighting not only against Hamas in the Gaza Strip, but against Iran and its proxies from seven different territories in the region. Then we're not really going to get to the guts of how to solve the problem either. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Toby, a lot for that. I want to get back to the next chapter, as it were. So Dalal was saying political before economic, end military occupation. You just addressed that point. Julie Norman said there could be a bifurcation of the Gaza Strip, and there could be a sort of model economy going it down there. And the whole of the plan, as Lord Bruce says, was based on the fact that it was a plan of economic development by technocrats. Where do you stand on that?
Look, I think we have to be very, very pragmatic in the short term. Obviously, in the immediate term, we have also unimaginable humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip, levels of destruction as a result of the war that are really catastrophic. And so we obviously need emergency measures to address those immediate those immediate needs. And I think we'd all agree on.
So the next chapter is basically still on this basic humanitarian addressing and stopping the fighting. We're not.
That and moving forward with the agenda of disarming Hamas, of course. I do agree with Dalal in the sense that we do need to have a political framework and a shared and a consensus on a political horizon to give a basis for legitimacy in the long term. But I think we are not going to get to, and it's unrealistic to expect that we're going to get to broad consensus if we try to get into the details of what a permanent solution to the conflict is going to look like, because that is just not politically realistic. I think neither Israelis nor Palestinians are capable of engaging in those deep substantive discussions. But I think if we focus in on the Gaza Strip, there are areas of consensus that can be developed in terms of a form of governance, international elements combined with a Palestinian element introduced gradually over time. It's in Israel's interest for the burden of governing the Gaza Strip not to fall on the state of Israel and to create conditions for sustainable political order. But they have to focus on the real problem of how to ensure that Hamas does not again expand to fill that.
So it's sort of military thing on both sides, whichever viewpoint you go to. I want to give to you, Toby, and then to open to the panel this question that's come in from Mohammed Ishmael, which I rather like. Given their pragmatic mentality and the more positive experience with resolving conflict, would the nations of the Asia Pacific make better advisors or stabilization forces in the Israel-Palestine conflict than those of the West? And can I add my rider to that? It's been in my life with Henry Kissinger through to Tony Blair and whatever, and they haven't fixed it. Yet Asia seems to have a different way of dealing things. So Toby, would it be better to bring in the peacemakers of the Asia Pacific to do this?
Well, I think we can always learn a lot comparatively by looking at what's worked in other parts of the world, but I think it's careful not to lose sight of the specificities and the particular challenges in this case. It is fascinating to hear that there are states in Asia Pacific, Indonesia, for example, that maybe wish to be involved in a peacekeeping or a stabilization mission in the Gaza Strip, something obviously unprecedented really of the conflict. But I think that the issues are less kind of about the kind of wisdom or pragmatism of those states, but more about their willingness to take risks and sustain costs in what is extremely in an area, particularly the Gaza Strip, so fraught with danger and challenge. What we're talking about here is the need to disarm Hamas, which does not wish to be disarmed. Now, who is going to actually take that on? Israel has a modus operandi of doing that militarily, but that's what we've just reached a ceasefire to try and move on from that. Are there other forces, other actors that can implement that seriously, are willing to risk the welfare of their own people to do that? That's a major test.
Yeah, I think the question is more because we all know about the problems of the military occupation, as they call it, and disarming Hamas. I think this question was more about the long term, because in Asia, you have countries with different histories and different religions and different systems of government that all knock along and get together without constant war. Dalal Iriqat, do you think that the Asia Pacific would be better? The technocrats from there would be better than the Blairs and the Kissingers to deal with the problem?
We need a consortium of mediators and serious peacemakers from all over the world. But this takes me also to the trade roads competition, where Gaza can actually be the hub of this offloading, uploading at the expense of course, of the Suez Canal. There is a big project from the West in competing with China on the IMEC road, which we should not undermine. But I also want to build on what Toby was talking about when it comes to the non-state actors. I fully see your point on the danger of non-state actors in the region. Yet, how can you explain to me the fact that Israel, with a deliberate decision by the prime ministers, the successive ones, was empowering Hamas, was fueling the cash money from Tel Aviv to Gaza? How do you explain that Dov Vice-Clad's, Sharon's aide at that moment said, we did not liberate Gaza.
Can I interrupt that? Because we're not talking about history. We're talking about
because he said
as from today. So we're looking for is the next chapter, not what everybody's done wrong in the past.
That's exactly what I'm trying to say. That Hamas is the fig leaf and that Gaza was never liberated. When Sharon withdrew, it was unilateral. He withdrew the settlers, but not for one single day. Control over the borders of Gaza, whether from the land or the sea or the sky, were given to the Palestinians.
So just to nail that down before I move to what you're saying is that
Israel had empowered a reasoning to the elimination of the Palestinian right of self-determination.
That needs to stop. And that needs to stop.
They had empowered the division between the West Bank and Gaza by empowering
the next chapter would be stopping Israel's empowerment of Hamas, in your view.
We should realize that as experts in the region. We should not only blame it on the non-state actors believing that they came from the space.
Yeah. Okay. Julie Norman, can we go back to the idea that instead of having the Western predominated peace plans and everything, that we look to the Asia Pacific, where they've settled more wars more recently with less violence?
Well, I would echo what's already been said. I mean, I think Dalal said rightly that there's going to need to be an international kind of effort to address this. But I would also echo what Toby said, in that states are going to need an interest and a willingness to engage directly in somewhere like Gaza. And we have seen, as Toby said, Indonesia, also Malaysia, Azerbaijan, countries that are, we don't really think of as contributing to Middle East kind of consortiums, but there are many states that are offering to help right now. But we have to also be realistic about the states that have the capacity, the will, the interest, and also the leverage to be able to do anything productive in the region. And I think we also want to be cautious of setting up a kind of a West versus China kind of dynamic in the rebuilding of Gaza as we move forward also.
So is there a figure, and anybody can jump in, is there a figure, a sort of Tony Blair type of figure or Jared Kushner type of figure from Asia that could come in and have the trust of all sides on this to say, look, this is how to get a peace? Or does that character not exist?
I mean, I would not look beyond the region. I would start in the region. There are actually many forces in the region that could be positive catalysts towards diplomatic progress. We saw with the breakthrough of the Abraham Accords what is possible. With the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain in particular, Morocco normalizing their relations with Israel. And there is a huge, potential here with the role of Saudi Arabia. The potential of Israeli normalization with Saudi Arabia is a huge incentive that Israelis across the board are very, very attracted to. And that offer, that potential, and all of the implications, including the India, Middle East, Europe corridor, which I think Dalal was alluding to, are unlocked through that normalization promise. And if
can I just go back to the other two on this? People within the region to lead this, Julie?
Yes, I would echo that, and I would even drill down even more to that regional actors, global actors can play a supportive role. But I think getting back to Dalal's point, you need to have local ownership too, and Palestinian ownership within Gaza, and we need to be thinking about that as well as who is playing these supporting roles around.
Can I also add?
Sorry, go on.
Can I also add one point of the need that we need to zoom out of Gaza and look at the question of Palestine. Because if Israel continues to use the pretext of Hamas and Gaza, what is happening in the West Bank?
Okay, the whole of the Palestine issue. I'm now going to
daily basis. We go back to the actions of Israel.
I want to come back to you all in a few minutes for a top line on the next chapter. But for the moment, we're going to go to Barry Gardiner, who has been listening to our debate and is going to tell us, Barry, have any of our toes touched new ground on this?
Well, first of all, Humphrey, let me check that you can all hear me.
Yes.
Good. Okay, because the persistent problems with audio and visual aligning have beset me again this afternoon. It seems to me that we have covered a lot of ground, but much of it has been...
You're breaking up very badly, Barry.
Let me try something else. Can you hear me at all?
Give us another go.
Can you hear me at all?
We'll give it a go, and then if it doesn't work, we'll move back to the three of us. Yep.
turning my camera off and hope that that will make a difference to the sound. You'll all be relieved anyway that you don't have to look at me while I'm talking.
Yeah, that's better. We can hear you now. Yep.
Okay. Look, we started off with Charles talking about the month since the declaration, no timeline for implementation, though, and the failure to address the West Bank and Palestinian disunity. Talked about the technocratic solution for peace through growth, and that neither Hamas reticence nor Israel's behavior seem to be moving the situation forward. Julie gave us some hope at the beginning, I felt, when she talked about, look, there has been the hostage prisoner release, but of course she then made it clear that there was a delay in the release of the 4 deceased whose bodies are still not back with their loved ones. And she also pointed to the problem that in the meantime, I think I'm right in saying
Barry Gardiner, I think, has left us. Well, let us, Barry, and if you can hear us, I think we're going to have to move on. What I'd like to do is now go back to each of the panel in the order that we came in and give us a little longer than a top line. I was going to just say top line of where you just sum up the next chapter. And I think what we're talking about for the next chapter is that there is peace, that people aren't fighting each other anymore, and there's a chance to develop agency and the economy. How do we get to that? Julie.
Yeah, a big thing to try and sum up, but thank you. I think we've kind of been talking in around 3 tiers of how to think about this. One is within Gaza, one is Palestine or Israel-Palestine more broadly, including the West Bank, and then one is regionally. And I think there's a lot of challenges, there's a lot of opportunities at each level right now. But I do think that we need to be clear-eyed and realistic about the fact that I think we're going to be in a tough period, I think, for a while, with a lot of backsliding, a lot of back and forth, a lot of frustration. But I think it's always with this conflict, there's a sense of needing to still, I think in a medium and long-term trajectory also, and not give up when there is when we're in kind of the reality that we're in the short term. I think Perez
is the timeline a few months, a few years, a few decades, as in Bosnia, for example, that Charles mentioned?
I think all of the above. I think a few months to any kind of proper stabilization. I mean, we're still seeing, as I said, deaths and destruction of infrastructure like daily up through today. And so we need to see some kind of stabilization. I think it's going to be years before we really see any kind of meaningful disarmament governing these kinds of things. And it may be decades before we get to an actual viable, sustainable kind of way forward. But I think we're in for a while.
So this next chapter has been years. Dalal, give us your end thoughts in a minute.
Well, I think Hamas had made it clear that they want to come under the umbrella of the PNA. And so let's not exaggerate the talk about disarmament and decommissioning. The Palestinians were ready for that. And let's also not equate between the power of nuclear Israel and the civilians who are disarmed in Gaza, who are under the Israeli fire. The fact that we are still tolerating that the Prime Minister of Israel and many ministers in the cabinet have already, arrest warrants against them from the ICC. They are criminals by definition. Is really not something that any conscious mind should be tolerating. So when I talk about the need to end the Israeli military occupation, this is not a Palestinian demand. This is what the ICJ had ruled for. So if we are serious about a sustained strategic peace for the Palestinians, for the Israelis, and for the region, we have to realize that applying international law equally on all citizens, whether they are Palestinians or Israelis, should be where we start. and the definition of the border of that, and the recognitions. And here, as we were talking from the UK as well, the UK had recognized Palestine. Now the UK needs to accept that they have moral and legal obligations in their bilateral relationship, not only with the Palestinians, but with Israel.
Right, so the next chapter, that's going to be several years to get to that point that you're talking about there.
But it's sad. It's sad. Why are we tolerating, as experts, as scholars, as humans, that somebody is acting pariah, somebody is acting wrong, somebody is acting with full impunity, while every war crime is documented, and we're tolerating that? My end note, no, I want to end on a positive note, that the Palestinians have been suffering for decades, yet the Palestinians are still willing to engage, are still willing to come on board in a negotiating and diplomatic path forward that would bring peace, security, and stability to everybody, but with guarantees from the lessons learned. Thank you.
Toby Green, your final thoughts.
Thank you. I mean, just to premise, I mean, Dalal asked a question about, Netanyahu and him being responsible for kind of, empowering Hamas over this. I mean, that's a part of the internal political discourse in Israel as well. He faces that challenge and accusation from Israelis also. But Israel did not create Hamas, and nor did it come from space. Hamas is an expression of Islamist extremism, which comes from
the military occupation.
Okay, there are groups all over the world.
We need to understand the connections. So Hamas is an expression of Islamist extremism. It is backed by very powerful political actors in the region, including Iran militarily, including politically and economically.
So would the next chapter, Toby, be what Dalal mentioned?
So I think
that Hamas wants to join the political umbrella, can't come under the political umbrella.
So what we're going to need is an international mechanism that can actually have serious teeth in tackling the threat of Hamas and the seriousness of that challenge. We're going to need assurances for Israel. Baked into those mechanisms, we're going to need sustained pressure on Hamas, both from the US and Western actors, but also from Arab actors in the region, and pressure, of course, on the Israeli side as well, and pressure on the Palestinian Authority to do the reforms it needs to do to become a credible actor in the Gaza Strip. And we're going to need a clear set of incentives, an end state that is also addresses Israel's need for legitimacy, security, and integration into the region. That is the role for Saudi Arabia and normalization. And a lot of this success of this is going to depend on the outcome of those different factors, but also of the domestic political processes in Israel and the outcome of the coming Israeli election. But having a clear vision that is credible to Israelis of what will be the rewards and payoffs if they're willing to make concessions like allowing the PA back into the Gaza Strip, that also can have an impact on Israeli public's political electoral choices also, which is going to be critical.
We have to stop now because we are out of time, but we need a political vision. We need several years, and I think we need the extremism or that thing to come in. But thank you so much, everybody. I learned a lot. I think we covered a lot of ground. Barry, I see you're back, but we've covered for you. Are you here to say farewell? Times wing chariot attacks. We must close. Thank you, Toby Green, Dalal Iriqat, Julie Norman, for giving us a really stimulating and a refreshing discussion from my part. And thank you all for the Democracy Forum for bringing us together. Our next debate is at 2 p.m. on November the 26th, on Wednesday, November the 26th, countering weaponization of the US dollar in global trade. That is a big topic. Join us then. And until then, from all of us at the Democracy Forum, stay safe and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Democracy Forum is a not-for-profit organisation founded in 2009 under the patronage of Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne. Its principal goal was to work for the furtherance of democracy, peace and the rule of law in order to counter religious fundamentalism and intolerance in our global communities. In an increasingly fractured world, this goal continues to be the driving force behind all of the Forum's activities. Lord Charles Bruce is the current president of the Forum. Since its inception, the Forum has hosted and co-hosted seminars on a wide variety of topics relating to democracy and human rights across the world. The Democracy Forum encourages academics, students, journalists and other socially and politically conscious people to attend our seminars and to participate in the question and answer session. Details are available on our website, thedemocracyforumlimited.com.